So this video is focusing on the multi-store model of memory, which is one of your key theories for GCSE psychology under memory. You need to be able to describe and evaluate it. Now, the multi-store model of memory is probably the most famous model of memory. It was also what we call like the foundation model, because many models that we use now, like working memory examples, all stem and agree with the multi-store model of memory, which is literally the idea that human memory itself is broken up into three very separate and distinct stores. And those stores are sensory, short-term and long-term memory. Now, the sensory store is the first store, which is where all information is inputted into our brain through our senses. Now, it's also very immediate, so you have to be paying attention to it for the information to be inputted. So, for example, we don't use all 5 senses at the same time. So like now, I'm paying attention to what I can hear, because I'm checking that I'm not saying a load of garbage, and what I can see, so I'm making sure that what I'm saying is in time with the PowerPoint. I'm not paying attention to what I can taste right now or what I'm touching right now, etc., because I don't require that information. Now, once I'm paying attention to that sensory information, it gets passed into short-term memory. Now, this is a memory store here which has a limited capacity and duration. So it means I can't pay attention to everything, I can't hold on to everything, and I also can't hold on to it for long, and I'll go into the specifics of this in a second. But if I can get that information from short-term into long-term memory through what we call the rehearsal loop, then actually our long-term memory store, which is our third separate and distinct store, has unlimited capacity and unlimited duration. So this is where I can store, in theory, all of my memories until the rest of my life, so I can keep information there. Now, this is the best diagram, I think, anyway, that explains the multi-store model. So you can see in green in the center of the screen, you've got your 3 distinct stages here, your distinct stores. We've got sensory memory, short-term and long-term. Now, if I explain the process through this picture, information is input from the environment into our sensory memory. Now, it's actually inputted to represent the sense that it's representing. So, for example, right now, you are inputting auditory information through your ears into your sensory memory, and because you're paying attention to it, hopefully you're listening to what I'm saying and you want to learn about it, so it's being passed into your short-term memory. So we're currently in this store at the moment. Now, this store is particularly interesting because information here can be shunted out of this store, so the process of displacement might take place. Now, this is basically because your short-term memory has only got a limited capacity, so it basically means that we can hold between 5 and 9 items within our short-term memory at any time. So this means, for example, that a piece of information in there that I maybe told you 20 seconds ago that you're now thinking isn't as important might be pushed out by the next piece of information I'm giving you now. And that's this idea of displacement, where the newest information is taking priority. Now, what happens is information is often forgotten from short-term memory, and that's why we say it has an output down here. So you're not able to remember every single thing that you're told within short-term memory. However, what they're suggesting within multi-store model is that if you rehearse that information in short-term memory, you're able to transfer it into your long-term memory. So, for example, if you're listening to what I'm saying and you're going, right, okay, and you're repeating it to yourself and you're going, right, so we've got 5 to 9 items, we've got, it'll only hold information for 18 to 30 seconds, and you're saying this to yourself again and again and again, that is how you get information into your long-term memory store, where we know over here we've got an unlimited capacity, so it can hold all sorts of different items for an unlimited duration, so for an unlimited amount of time. Now, what happens is, once we've got information in our long-term memory as well, we can also then use that to retrieve information back into short-term. So, for example, if I said to you, guys, remember what I taught you last week? Remember when we talked about multi-store model in the first place? I'm asking you to go into your long-term memory to retrieve an information that a memory that we've put in there and bring it into your short-term memory so that we can use it within that particular lesson. And the multi-store model explains that by saying that this is a two-way process between short and long-term memory. Now, again, if you really think about this, then this does make sense. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation or a room where you were hearing, there was lots of chatter going on and you were talking to the person in front of you, but you also kind of listening to the conversation behind you. And then the person that you're talking to says, did you just hear what I said? And then you're able to say, yeah, you just said, go and get the ice cream from the counter. And you didn't really realise that you'd heard them say that, but because the information was still available to you at the time, they were still in your sensory store, you were able to kind of quickly pay attention to them, move them into your short-term memory, and that's why you were able to use them. And I think you'll see this quite a lot in class, where your teacher kind of picks on the person that they don't think are paying attention, and they say, oh, what did I just say? and then they're able to say the information back, or maybe the second half of the sentence that the teacher's just said, because their short-term memory and their sensory memory is still holding on to that information. So again, just checking the keywords that I've mentioned so far. So we've got this attention, this idea that you've got to be paying attention to the information that you're being given in order to be able to move it into the sensory store and then the short-term store. We talked about this idea of information decaying, so it might fade over a long period of time until it becomes forgotten. Capacity, we're talking about the amount of space that a certain store can hold. So remember we said that the capacity of the short-term memory is between 5 and 9 items, and the capacity of the long-term memory is unlimited. And then duration is this idea of how long something can last. So we said within short-term memory we're talking about 18 to 30 seconds, whereas long-term memory we're talking unlimited. So again, the sensory store, we have covered this so far, so we have to pay attention to it, if not it decays. But the difference in the capacity again between short-term and long-term is this idea of short-term memory holding between 5 and 9 items for about 30 seconds, or we displace it, so new information replaces it, or it can go into long-term memory where we've got unlimited space. And the same again for capacity. So short-term information, we've got 18 to 30 seconds, because if it's not held there for very long, if we don't pass it on, it becomes displaced or it decays. But if we can get it into our long-term memory, it should, in theory, be held there forever. Now, that doesn't mean it's freely available. We might need a cue, or we might need a bit of a trigger to help us go and get that information, but it should be in there somewhere. Now, interestingly, there are differences between how the stores encode. Short-term memory encodes predominantly acoustically, but also visually, and the long-term memory encodes predominantly semantics, so mainly the meaning of things, but it can also encode acoustically and visually as well. There's an exam question on the board if you want to pause and just have a practice at what a question like this might require you to do in terms of applying your understanding of the multi-store model. Another one here for describing, so this is just an AO1 question. Another question here, quite straightforward, but a difference between short-term and long-term memory. So again, on this one, you can talk about differences within duration, capacity, or encoding. An AO2 question, we actually did this one in lesson. I appreciate it's quite tricky, but you've got to pick apart the information to explain why Jack can't remember the digits of the telephone number. And we talked about on this one how you might suggest as well that if Jack was to chunk the 11 digits of the phone number together in order to be able to reduce the capacity, so rather than trying to encode 11 items, which we know our short-term memory isn't capable of, Jack could say 0777, and actually by chunking those 4 digits together into one chunk of information, then that therefore reduces the capacity on the short-term memory. Mark scheme if you want to have a look. And another one here, Paul struggles to remember things due to an accident. Try and explain this using the multi-store model. Just a little tip here as well, remember that explain within this psychology always means identify, justify. So identify the reason using the information that's relevant from the multi-store model, and then justify that back to Paul and why he needs that information. So strengths of the multi-store model then, it's really clear, it's really straightforward. It also is backed up by lots of cases of things like amnesia, which show that we can have damage to long-term stores, but short-term store can be intact. If you watch the amnesia video as well, it also talks about this idea of the two stores, short-term and long-term memory, potentially being intact, but it's that rehearsal loop that might be damaged that therefore with antegrade amnesia makes it difficult for us to encode new memories because that rehearsal loop prevents us transferring information from short-term to long-term memory. There's also loads of evidence from thousands and thousands of memory experiments that do support this idea of long-term and short-term memory being totally different stores. And if we apply the multi-store model to the cognitive neuropsychology, where we start saying, well, whereabouts in the brain is this happening, we can actually find evidence as well that biologically our short-term and long-term memory are stored within different parts of the brain as well. Murdoch provides evidence to support the multi-store model. He discovered something called the serial position effect. Now, this is what we call primary recency. And they're basically saying that if you were giving participants a list of words, they will find it easier to remember lists at the words, at the beginning of the list, so the primary, because they've been able to rehearse that and transfer the information into long-term memory. And they'll also be able to remember words at the very end of the list, which is what we call the recency, so the ones that they remembered recently, is because that they're still being held in short-term memory. But the problem is when you've got those middle words within the list, they're the ones that get forgotten because we didn't have the opportunity to rehearse them and transfer them into long-term memory, and they, ran out of duration as such, ran out of time in the short-term memory. So if you think about it, this idea of primary recency supports this idea of information being in either short-term or long-term. However, it has been criticised for overstating the role of rehearsal as the only way of getting information into long-term memory. We know actually that a lot of the long-term memories that you have might be because of something emotional. It might be because something really special happened to you, or something really horrible happened to you, or something that you felt was really important at the time and therefore you really wanted to remember it. They might be a lot of the type of memories that you have in long-term memory, and actually they're not there because you repeated them and you rehearsed them. They're there because they've got a different meaning to you. Think about how you learned to ride a bike. Like, you don't use that memory necessarily every time you get on a bike. It's a different type of memory, and therefore people kind of criticize the multi-store model for not taking into account different types of memory, different types of long-term memory, and therefore it's criticized as being quite overly simplistic, so it doesn't take into account other factors. We could also say that multi-store model is reductionist if you've got onto your issue and debate here, because it's reducing something really complex like memory into really, really simple components. Equally within this, it's unlikely that we only have one type of long-term memory, like we just said. Clive Waring is an example of this. So Clive Waring's long-term memory was damaged in terms of he couldn't remember, he couldn't encode, more information into his long-term memory, but he could play the piano. So he couldn't remember he couldn't remember personal events such as going to university, things like that, but he can remember how to play the piano. And the argument here is that maybe playing the piano, it is a long-term memory, but maybe it's what we call a procedural memory, so a memory of a procedure, and therefore that's different than maybe an episodic memory or a memory of an episode of your life. So again, it's this argument that this long-term store within the multi-store model is much more complex than maybe it's making it sound, and therefore we need to do a little bit more research into that. And then finally, my top tip with this is to make sure you've got evidence as well. Now, the best piece of evidence for you to remember is Miller, because Miller gives us evidence for the fact that the capacity of the short-term memory is between 5 and 9 items. Miller basically says the same, but he says it's 7 plus or minus 2. Well, obviously minus 7 is 5 and plus 7 is 9, so we're literally saying the same thing. But Miller provides evidence for the fact that the capacity of short-term memory is between 5 and 9 items. So again, it supports what the multi-store model is saying. It kind of proves it right, it proves it true. So it's a good piece of evidence to include there.